You're done here, Kendall. Pack up your theories and go." The room froze, her slides still glowing behind her. Proof, logic, progress, all dismissed with one sentence. Nash Baker smiled for the cameras, the perfect picture of authority, putting a woman back in her place. But she didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, just closed her laptop, slowly. Because while he thought he was ending her presentation, he was actually starting hers. What no one in that glass room knew yet was that the receipts were already printed. And by the next board meeting, his microphone wouldn't be the only thing cut off. Stay with us. Because what begins as a public humiliation ends in a power shift no one saw coming. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated at work, dismissed, talked over, or replaced, only to come back stronger, quieter, and undeniable? The glass walls of Brightstone Media's boardroom gleamed under the morning sun, reflecting the skyline like a silent audience. Inside, a dozen executives sat in crisp silence, pens poised, eyes on the woman standing at the head of the table. Kendall Roberts spoke with the calm precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. Charts glowed behind her, numbers flowing across the screen in clean arcs of logic. "If we continue reallocating resources to digital licensing," she said, her tone even but sure, "we'll see a 12% increase in ROI by Q4. Her confidence filled the space, not loud, not boastful, but certain. Across the polished oak table, Nash Baker leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the rest. His silver hair caught the light like a crown. His smile was the kind that could sell anything except sincerity. For years, Brightstone had been his empire, and every person in that room played their part in upholding it. But Kendall wasn't just another loyal subject. Her success came from insight, not obedience, and that made her dangerous. When she clicked to the next slide, Nash's voice sliced through the air like glass breaking. "That's enough," he said. The interruption was deliberate, timed to humiliate. A murmur flickered through the room. Kendall paused, the clicker still in her hand. "I wasn't finished," she said, her tone steady. Nash smiled, but his eyes were cold. "You've made your point. Your numbers are theoretical. What we need are results, not dreams dressed up in graphs." The words hung there, sharp, dismissive, impossible to ignore. One of the younger executives shifted uncomfortably, staring at his notes as if they could hide him from the tension. Kendall inhaled slowly. Every part of her wanted to respond, to remind him that it was her projections that had saved his last merger. But she saw the trap. Nash wasn't looking for dialogue, he was performing dominance. So she simply said, "Understood." That single word unsettled him more than any argument would have. She closed her laptop with composure so graceful it almost felt rehearsed. Around the table, no one dared move. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Nash cleared his throat, masking discomfort with authority. "We'll revisit this next quarter. Thank you for your effort." Kendall gathered her notes, her movements quiet, efficient, precise. As she turned toward the door, her reflection in the glass caught her gaze. Tall, steady, unbroken. Behind her, Nash smirked, believing he had silenced her. But what he didn't see, what no one yet understood, was that he hadn't ended her presentation. He had just introduced her next chapter. A stunned silence fell over the room, so thick it drowned out the city noise beyond the glass. Even the hum of the projector seemed to pause. Kendall's heart beat in a steady rhythm, her face unreadable as Nash's words echoed through the boardroom. "Relieved of your position." He didn't even bother to disguise the satisfaction curling around the edges of his mouth. The man who once praised her insight in front of investors now spoke her dismissal like a victory toast. She closed her folder slowly, each movement deliberate, her mind racing behind calm eyes. Years of discipline had taught her that silence could be louder than protest. Still, the sting was real, not from the loss of a title, but from the audacity of a man who mistook cruelty for control. She rose from her chair with a poise that made the gesture feel regal. "Understood, Mr. Baker." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. The lack of emotion was her shield. Across the table, a few glances shifted toward the floor. No one dared speak. Ava Torres, seated near the corner, met Kendall's eyes for a fleeting second, the kind of glance that said, "I see you, and I'll remember this." Nash's smirk deepened as he turned toward the board. "Let's proceed," he said, as if firing a woman in front of her peers was a routine administrative note. Kendall gathered her notes into a single neat stack, then placed her pen precisely beside them. She didn't rush. Every motion was deliberate, disciplined. When she finally turned to leave, she caught her reflection in the glass wall, a woman in a charcoal suit, posture tall, gaze steady. Behind her, the men resumed talking about profits and projections, as though nothing had happened. As she reached the door, Nash added, "And Kendall, next time, try to think before you overreach." The words landed like a final shove. She paused, one hand on the handle, then glanced back over her shoulder just long enough to meet his eyes. "Thank you for the feedback," she said evenly. The calmness in her tone made his jaw tighten. Outside the boardroom, the air felt heavier, colder. Assistants pretended to work, pretending not to know what had just occurred. Kendall's heels clicked against the marble floor, each step precise, controlled. When the elevator doors closed behind her, the composure in her eyes flickered for just a second, not with defeat, but with fire. Nash Baker thought he had silenced her. But humiliation has a strange alchemy. In the right hands, it turns to power. By noon, the news had spread like spilled ink across every floor of Brightstone. The assistants whispered first, voices low over coffee machines and Slack messages that vanished as quickly as they appeared. "Did you hear?" In front of the whole board. She didn't even flinch. By the time the lunch hour hit, everyone knew Kendall Roberts had been dismissed in the middle of a presentation, and no one knew why. The story shifted with every retelling, but one detail never changed. She walked out, standing tall. From the corner of the 21st floor cafe, Kendall watched it unfold. Her badge still worked, for now, and she had no intention of hiding. Her espresso sat untouched, cooling beside a pile of unsigned exit paperwork. The energy around her was electric in that uneasy, gossipy way only corporate offices could generate. A few people she once mentored gave her polite nods, but avoided her table. Others peeked over laptops, their curiosity poorly disguised as concern. Ava slid into the seat across from her, setting down a folder thick with legal notes. "You know this wasn't spontaneous," she said quietly. "He's been laying the groundwork for weeks." Probably since you challenged that budget cut, Kendall met her gaze without surprise. "The Outreach Fund." Ava nodded grimly. "The one that helped independent filmmakers from minority communities." Nash said it wasn't profitable. Kendall's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't supposed to be." "It was supposed to matter." Ava leaned forward, voice low. "He's painting you as reckless, unaligned with company goals. It's the classic move. Push out the one woman with principles before she becomes too influential." She flipped open the folder, showing Kendall a summary of recent internal memos, all with subtle but telling language. Misalignment, risk management, transition of leadership. It was a paper trail written like a warning. Kendall studied the pages in silence. Anger simmered beneath her calm exterior, but it wasn't the kind that burned out quickly. It was quiet, strategic, measured. She closed the folder and slid it back across the table. If he's been preparing for this, then so have I. Ava raised a brow. Meaning? Kendall's faint smile carried no humor. Meaning I keep copies of everything I touch. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The buzz of conversations around them faded, replaced by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass. Finally, Ava exhaled. Be careful, Kenny. He plays dirty. Kendall stood, straightened her blazer, and gathered her things. Then it's time someone showed him what clean power looks like. She left her coffee untouched, cold but perfectly steady, just like her resolve. The building had emptied into silence, the kind that settles after a storm. Only the echo of distant footsteps and the soft swish of a mop broke the stillness. Kendall stood in the doorway of the conference room, the same one that had witnessed her humiliation hours earlier. The air still carried the faint scent of cologne and power, a mix of espresso, ambition, and arrogance. The table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, her presentation slides frozen on the last frame. Projected growth, Q4 and beyond. The irony wasn't lost on her. She crossed the room slowly, her heels clicking softly against the marble. Scattered papers littered the table, carelessly left behind by executives too eager to escape discomfort. Kendall gathered them with practiced precision, scanning charts and graphs she had spent weeks perfecting. And then she saw it. A file folder marked with Nash's initials, half buried beneath a pile of expense reports. Curiosity sharpened into intuition. She opened it. The pages told a story written in deceit. Redirected funds, falsified invoices, a shell corporation tucked into a subsidiary. It was all there, hidden beneath jargon and numbers that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know where to look. But Kendall knew. Every inconsistency, every misstep, every missing decimal screamed one truth. Nash Baker wasn't just arrogant, he was corrupt. She pulled out her phone, the glow of the screen reflecting in the polished glass wall behind her. With steady hands, she began photographing each page, one by one. The click of the camera shutter echoed softly, rhythmic and deliberate. Her reflection stared back at her. Composed, unreadable, resolute. You tried to erase me, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I'll make you transparent. For a long moment she stood there, letting the weight of what she held settle in. This wasn't revenge, it was accountability, the kind that couldn't be silenced by power or titles. She slid the documents back exactly as she'd found them and straightened the stack with care. When she turned to leave, the night janitor looked up from the far end of the hall and offered a polite nod. Kendall returned it with a faint smile, her steps unhurried, her mind already a storm of calculation. She pressed the elevator button, the metallic doors sliding open with a quiet sigh. As they closed around her, she caught her reflection one last time. Not the woman who'd been humiliated, but the one who was about to rewrite the ending. The executive lounge glittered like the private den of a king who believed his crown untouchable. City lights spilled through the windows, painting the glass with streaks of gold. Nash Baker lounged in a leather armchair, one leg crossed, a glass of bourbon balanced effortlessly in his hand. The ice clinked as he swirled it, his laughter filling the air. Smooth, performative, designed to reassure. You can't run a company on feelings, he said to the half circle of investors seated before him. Sentimentality doesn't build empires. Discipline does. They nodded, some out of habit, some out of fear. The men and women who once admired him now wore polite masks of agreement. Nash saw it, but chose to ignore it. To him, unease was a challenge, not a warning. The smell of expensive liquor and polished wood wrapped around him like armor. Kendall Roberts was talented, he continued, but she didn't understand hierarchy. You can't have two captains steering one ship. His grin was rehearsed, his tone a shade too light. But beneath the surface confidence, Something in him flickered. The board had been uncharacteristically quiet that afternoon. Miriam Holt, the chairwoman, hadn't returned his call. The CFO's assistant had avoided eye contact during their last exchange. Even his executive assistant, always cheerful, had seemed distant when she handed him the evening agenda. He told himself it was paranoia. Still, the silence lingered like static in the air. One of the investors, a tall man with a watch worth more than most salaries, leaned forward. "There's talk of an internal audit," he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. Nash's grip on his glass tightened just slightly. "Rumors," he replied, flashing that same confident smirk. "Every quarter there's a witch hunt." Keeps people busy. But his pulse had quickened, a dull beat behind his composed expression. The man nodded but didn't look convinced. "Interesting timing, though. Right after you dismissed your director of strategy." Nash's smile thinned. He raised his glass, hiding irritation behind a sip of amber liquid. "She was overreaching," he said, the words clipped. "Good at data, terrible at discipline." The investors exchanged glances that told a different story, one of quiet doubt. Outside the lounge, the city hummed with life, but for the first time, Nash felt something shift beneath his feet. The foundation he'd built on charm and control was cracking, and he didn't yet see the fault line forming in Kendall Roberts' hands. Morning light streamed through the lobby's glass facade, slicing through the air like a declaration. Conversations paused. Keyboards stilled. Every head seemed to turn as Kendall Roberts stepped inside Brightstone Media's headquarters as if nothing had changed. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, steady and sure, the sound echoing in the kind of silence that follows disbelief. She wore a crisp white blouse and a slate-gray blazer, the uniform of someone who refused to accept exile. The security guard at the front desk froze mid-sentence when he saw her. "Ms. Roberts, he began, uncertainty flickering across his face. Before he could finish, the elevator doors slid open. Out stepped Miriam Holt, regal as ever, her steel-gray curls framing a face that carried both grace and authority. "She's with me," Miriam said, her voice even, final. The guard nodded, instantly stepping aside. Kendall inclined her head in quiet acknowledgement, then followed Miriam toward the private elevator reserved for senior leadership. Inside the lift, the silence between them wasn't tense, it was deliberate. Miriam's gaze stayed fixed on the ascending numbers. "You've caused quite a stir," she said finally. Kendall smiled faintly. "So I've heard." Miriam's lips curved, not quite a smile, not quite disapproval. "Good. The board should be stirred now and then." When the doors opened to the executive floor, a wave of murmurs rippled through the corridor. Executives paused mid-step, some pretending to check their phones, others too stunned to hide their curiosity. Kendall felt their stares like heat on her back, but didn't flinch. Her stride never faltered. At the far end of the hallway, the boardroom loomed, the same stage where Nash Baker had dismissed her just one day earlier. Only this time he was already inside, flanked by his assistant and a cluster of uneasy faces. The air thickened as Kendall entered behind Miriam, the whispering halting instantly. Nash's jaw tightened, though his tone remained syrup-smooth. "Miriam, I wasn't aware Ms. Roberts would be joining us." "You are now," Miriam replied, settling into her chair at the head of the table. "We're convening to discuss certain irregularities in last quarter's reports." She folded her hands, eyes locking with Nash's. "And I believe Ms. Roberts may have insights into them." The shift in the room was palpable, electricity wrapped in restraint. Nash's smirk faltered. Kendall took her seat across from him, calm as glass, her folder resting neatly before her. For the first time, the balance of power didn't tilt toward him. It tilted toward truth, and Kendall had brought it with her. Nash straightened his tie before he spoke, a picture of corporate composure. "Let me start by saying that Ms. Roberts has been a valued member of this company," he began, his voice measured and falsely gracious. "However, recent findings suggest a lapse in oversight that has cost Brightstone significantly. It's unfortunate, but accountability is non-negotiable." He smiled thinly, the kind of smile meant for headlines, not humans. Around the table, a few board members nodded, out of habit more than conviction. Miriam Holt said nothing, her hands folded neatly, eyes unreadable. Kendall sat perfectly still until he finished, her expression almost serene. "May I respond?" she asked. Nash gestured toward her, feigning magnanimity. "By all means." She rose slowly, a clicker in her hand, her laptop already connected to the projector. The screen behind her came alive with numbers and color-coded charts, the same data Nash had dismissed as theoretical. Only this time, it wasn't theory. It was evidence. "Let's begin with the transfers," she said, her tone calm, surgical. A spreadsheet filled the wall, detailing wire movements between Brightstone subsidiaries and a consulting firm registered offshore. "These transactions were authorized under your name, Mr. Baker," she continued. "Each one routed through shell companies, none declared in our quarterly reports." A sharp murmur spread around the table. Nash's jaw clenched. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You're misinterpreting confidential financial data." Kendall didn't flinch. "Then perhaps you can explain why Brightstone funds were moved to an entity owned by your personal trust in the Cayman Islands." She clicked again. The next slide displayed an email chain, his signature clear as day, his words too specific to deny. Gasps broke the room's composure. Miriam leaned forward, her voice quiet but cutting. "Nash, is this accurate?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The facade cracked, the color drained from his face. "Those transfers were temporary reallocations," he stammered. "Completely legal. Then why hide them?" Kendall's question sliced through his excuses like glass. She stepped closer to the screen, her silhouette outlined against the evidence of his downfall. "You fired me for incompetence," she said softly. "But what you really feared was exposure." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to fade. Miriam's gaze swept the room, lingering on Nash, then on Kendall, the woman he had tried to erase now standing at the center of his unmasking. And when Kendall finally sat down, her voice calm and unwavering, she said the words that sealed his fate. "You fired me for your mistake." The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. Nash stood frozen, his once effortless charm slipping like paint in the rain. Miriam Holt's voice carried through the room with the steadiness of someone who had witnessed too many men confuse power for integrity. "Mr. Baker," she said, each word deliberate, "the board has reviewed your conduct and financial dealings. Your actions have violated both fiduciary duty and ethical policy." She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Authority radiated from her stillness. Around the table, murmurs began to surface, not loud enough to challenge, but enough to affirm. One by one, the board members who had once flattered Nash now turned their gazes elsewhere. The CFO cleared his throat. "It's disappointing," he muttered, unable to meet his eyes. Another board member, a man Nash had mentored, simply shook his head. "We trusted you." Nash opened his mouth, desperate to summon the voice that had once commanded every room he entered. "This is a misunderstanding," he started, forcing a shaky laugh. "I've built this company from the ground up. You all know me." But the conviction was gone, replaced by the hollow bravado of a man realizing the room no longer belonged to him. Miriam exchanged a glance with the board's legal advisor. "Effective immediately," she said. You are suspended from all duties pending investigation. You'll receive written notice within the hour." Her tone was clinical, almost merciful. Nash's face twitched with disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "After everything I've done for this company?" Kendall watched him quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. She hadn't spoken since presenting the evidence, and that silence had become its own power. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply held his gaze, steady and unflinching. That, more than anything, unmade him. "You did this," he hissed, the words barely audible. "You wanted this." Kendall's reply was measured. "No," she said softly. "You earned it." The words landed like a gavel. Nash's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from his posture. When Miriam signaled for security, he didn't resist. As he gathered his briefcase, the gleaming Brightstone logo on the wall seemed to mock him, a reflection of everything he thought he owned, now slipping through his fingers. The door shut behind him with a soft click, final and echoing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Miriam turned to Kendall. "You handled yourself with dignity," she said. Kendall inclined her head, calm but resolute. The storm had passed, but something deeper had begun. Not revenge, but a reckoning that would rewrite everything Brightstone stood for. The hallway outside the boardroom was empty, except for the echo of their footsteps. The hum of the city seeped faintly through the glass, a reminder that life continued even as empires fell. Nash trailed behind Kendall, his composure unraveling with each step. The mask he'd worn for years, smiles, handshakes, the illusion of control, was gone, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You think you've won?" Kendall stopped, the word "won" hanging in the air like smoke. She turned slowly to face him. His tie was crooked, his face flushed, and the bourbon from the night before lingered faintly in the space between them. She met his glare with the same unshakable calm that had dismantled him hours earlier. "I didn't come here to win," she said. "I came to tell the truth." "You just made sure everyone heard it." His laugh was short, bitter, unsteady. "You're nothing without this company," he snapped. "Without me." Her expression didn't change. "Then it's a good thing I never needed either." The words struck deeper than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Truth, she had learned, didn't need to shout. It only needed to stand still long enough to be undeniable. Nash stepped closer, searching her face for a crack, something human he could manipulate like he always had. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. No fear, no need for approval. No trace of the woman he had once silenced in front of a room full of men. His confidence faltered, and for the first time in years, Nash Baker looked small. "You think the board will keep you around?" he muttered. "They'll use you until it's convenient not to." "Maybe," she said quietly. "But I'd rather stand on uncertain ground than kneel on corruption." She turned away, the conversation already over. Her heels clicked down the hall in a rhythm that felt like closure. Behind her, Nash's reflection in the glass walls wavered, a powerful man reduced to a fading outline. He watched her disappear into the elevator, her posture straight, her purpose unshaken. The doors slid shut, cutting him off from the last person who had ever dared to look him in the eye without fear. In that mirrored hallway, Nash Baker finally understood what true loss looked like. It wasn't losing power. It was realizing that the people you'd ruled no longer cared that you had it. The air in the boardroom felt different this time, less tense, more uncertain, as though the building itself was holding its breath. A week had passed since Nash Baker's fall, but the ripple effects were still spreading through Brightstone's glossy corridors. Headlines had called it everything from a reckoning to a masterclass in quiet justice. Investors were restless, clients cautious, and employees caught between relief and fear. The company that once projected invincibility now stood at a crossroads, its reflection cracked but not beyond repair. Kendall sat near the end of the long glass table, a place she'd once been told to earn. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her notes untouched. She wasn't here to gloat or to claim victory. She was here because Miriam Holt had asked her to be. Across the table, the remaining board members shifted in their seats, some avoiding her eyes, others watching her as though seeing her for the first time. Miriam rose, her presence commanding even in silence. "We've lost public confidence," she began, her tone measured but resolute. "Brightstone needs stability, integrity, and a leader who understands that success without accountability is failure in disguise." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I propose Kendall Roberts as interim chief executive officer." The reaction was immediate. Murmurs, raised brows, the quick shuffle of papers. One member, a man who had been Nash's most vocal ally, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, she's untested at that level." Miriam's eyes flicked to him, cool and unimpressed. "So was Nash once," she replied. "And look where that brought us." The tension dissolved into silence. Another board member nodded slowly. "The staff trusts her," she said. "And after what she's handled, I trust her too." All eyes turned to Kendall. She felt the weight of their gaze like a spotlight, but she didn't shrink from it. "If the goal is to restore this company," she said evenly, "then it starts with transparency. Not slogans, not press releases. Honesty." Her voice was steady, her conviction unforced. The vote was swift and unanimous. Miriam's expression softened. "Congratulations, Ms. Roberts." Kendall exhaled, the smallest breath of release escaping her. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, her eyes moving to the Brightstone logo gleaming on the wall. Once, it had symbolized hierarchy and exclusion. Now, it reflected possibility, fragile, but real. The woman who had been humiliated in public now sat at the head of the table, not to replace power, but to redefine it. The ballroom shimmered with camera lights, a stage once ruled by Nash Baker's swagger now filled with quiet authority. Reporters crowded the aisles, flashes reflecting off polished marble and mirrored walls. The Brightstone logo glowed behind the podium, larger than life, but for the first time, it didn't overshadow the person standing before it. Kendall Roberts stepped up to the microphone in a sleek navy suit, the same calm in her expression that had carried her through humiliation, confrontation, and truth. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that comes before a reckoning wrapped in grace. She didn't shuffle her notes or adjust the mic. She simply looked out at the crowd of investors, employees, and journalists, her gaze steady. "Integrity isn't a liability," she began. Her voice was even, strong enough to carry without strain. "It's an asset. And for too long, this company and this industry have treated ethics as something optional. It's not. It's the foundation." The cameras clicked furiously. The sound filled the pauses between her words like punctuation. Behind the lens, 1,000 people watched live, and tens of thousands more tuned in online. Kendall spoke not from rehearsed rhetoric, but from lived experience. She talked about rebuilding trust, not through promises, but through transparency, about creating space where every employee's voice could exist without fear. "The measure of leadership," she said, "isn't how loudly you speak in the room. It's how you treat the people no one's watching." As she spoke, the employees gathered in the back began to smile, some nodding through tears they didn't try to hide. In cubicles across the city, staff paused their work to stream the broadcast. For women who had been talked over in meetings, dismissed in reviews, or told to tone it down, Kendall's words felt like oxygen. When she finished, she didn't pause for applause. She simply said, "Brightstone will move forward by remembering who built it, not just those whose names are on the door, but those whose hands keep the lights on." The room erupted, not with polite claps, but with genuine applause that carried weight. Miriam Holt rose first, her eyes glistening with pride. "Well done, Ms. Roberts," she said quietly. Within hours, the speech flooded social media. Hashtags like #IntegrityIsPower and #KendallRoberts Rising trended worldwide. Comment sections filled with gratitude and awe. Yet Kendall, watching the footage later from her quiet office, didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled because she knew this wasn't about victory. It was about rewriting what power could look like when rooted in truth. The office was hushed, emptied of its daytime pulse. Only the soft hum of the city below filled the silence, its rhythm steady, eternal. The glass walls that once reflected ambition now mirrored something gentler. The quiet aftermath of a storm survived. Kendall walked slowly down the corridor, her heels whispering against the polished floor. The awards lining the hallway glinted faintly under the dim light, testaments to a legacy built on both brilliance and blindness. She stopped before the window Nash Baker had once called his view of the empire. Outside, Manhattan shimmered, sharp, luminous, alive. But tonight, it felt less like a conquest and more like a conversation. Her reflection merged with the skyline, her face framed by the lights that stretched endlessly outward. For the first time, she saw not just what she had built, but what she had refused to become. The title on her office door meant less than the way she had earned it. She had fought back without shouting, exposed corruption without cruelty, and reclaimed her place not by force, but by presence. Power had always been her quiet rebellion. The elevator chimed in the distance and a familiar voice broke the stillness. "You're still here." Ava stepped into the glow, her coat draped loosely over one arm, exhaustion softened by pride. She joined Kendall at the window, their reflections side by side. Two women who had outlasted a system designed to underestimate them. "You did it," Ava said, her voice low, almost reverent. Kendall's lips curved into a faint smile. "No," she murmured. "We did." It wasn't a correction. It was truth. Every late-night conversation, every moment of doubt, every choice to hold her ground instead of folding, it had been shared, felt, and carried together. They stood in silence, watching the lights pulse like distant heartbeats. Somewhere down below, a digital billboard flashed her image beside the headline, "Integrity isn't a liability." Kendall let out a quiet laugh, half disbelief, half acceptance. "Funny," she said. "I spent years chasing respect. Turns out I just had to stop needing it." Ava smiled. "That's how you know you've arrived." Kendall reached for the switch beside the glass wall. The lights dimmed, leaving the city's glow to take their place. As she and Ava walked toward the elevator, the office behind them faded into shadow. Not an ending, but an exhale. Because real power, she understood now, wasn't loud or ruthless. It was grace, steady, earned, and unshakably hers. If this story struck a chord, share it. Somewhere, a woman is being silenced in a meeting she built from the ground up, and she needs to know her composure is her power. Comment below if you've ever been dismissed in public but proved yourself in private until they had no choice but to say your name in the boardroom. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.